What is up, slackers, and welcome to another episode of the Stuck in the Middle podcast. And I am your host, Jason Eck. So this week, I had a ton of different ideas about topics that I wanted to cover. But I couldn't really get it all crystallized in my head for a single topic, a single subject. So this week is going to be the first of what may be many, a new segment that I have decided to call Whatever Wednesday. So, whatever, right? On the Gen X Tropes podcast, I talked about how that whole whatever thing, whatever, like that's like the phrase that everyone in Gen X uses. And it's garbage. But for the purposes of the podcast, it makes perfect sense to say a free-form Friday, as they would say on the radio, is actually a Whatever Wednesday here at the Stuck in the Middle podcast. So one of the topics that had been kind of fiddling around in my head, just kind of, blowing through the cobwebs that is my brain, is someone who's been in the news recently. And I was thinking of doing a whole episode just dedicated to the one act. And I may still do that. But that was a lot of work. So whenever I do like the singular dives of a particular band, for example, I actually do some of the research. I don't just pull it out of my rear end, as I typically do. But the gentleman that's been in the news quite a bit lately, for a myriad of reasons, is one William Patrick Corgan, also known as Billy Corgan of the Smashing Pumpkins. So Billy is an interesting dude. So one of the things that I draw a hard line in the sand here on the podcast, I don't talk politics. If I wanted to do that, that would be a completely different podcast. I may do that someday. Who knows? But nevertheless, so Billy keeps popping up in all these various different circles, and people have a lot of opinions about what he does or he doesn't believe. So I don't know the guy. All I know is he may lean one way, he may lean another. I know at one point he called himself a libertarian capitalist. But, he got a lot of heat for going on Alex Jones' podcast. A lot of people have gone on there. I cast no aspersions on anyone for going and engaging in conversation. You know what I mean? It doesn't really matter what your political leanings are. I think conversation is awesome. You know what I mean? I think conversations are great. That's why I like to do the podcast, in particular with guests. I love talking about any particular topic and getting into it. So whether you are on the right or the left, there's plenty of media personalities, if you will, that can come together and have reasonable, rational, civil discussions. And I really appreciate that. Do I think, based upon my limited understanding of where Billy Corgan lays in all this, I think he could probably have a reasonable conversation. That's just my opinion. I think he probably could. So I'm sure there are preconceived notions. But that's neither here nor there. So Billy is in the news for two reasons. So one, for the first time in, I don't know how long, minimally, I want to say 7 years, since the Smashing Pumpkins, mostly a full unit from the original group, right? So Darcy, James Iha, Billy Corgan, Jimmy Chamberlain, right? So that's the core. So Darcy and Billy had a falling out years ago. It hasn't been reestablished yet. But nevertheless, huge tour, doing hockey arenas. So not quite the massive arenas in most markets, but good size arenas. And I think they're on the docket here in Massachusetts, maybe for the TD Garden, which is both hockey and basketball. Pretty big venue. That's a big arena. And in support on this tour are Jane's Addiction, and kind of a show that I was interested in, but the timing just didn't line up. But apparently, Billy has had to pull out of a couple of gigs, or the most recent gig, due to a throat issue. So laryngitis in particular, but going to a throat doctor and specialist. So in that regard, I just want to say I hope that he recovers and is able to continue on the tour. In part, just because that the bands of that era, I have never shied away from it here on the podcast. I love that era. Because of my age, I definitely straddled, the fences of the glam rock into the grunge. And I just hope it just in general, like, for all the people who have purchased tickets, want to see the show. Because whenever I think about big concert tours, I always think about the people who are the riggers and the stagehands and the equipment movers and the truck drivers, like all of that. There's such an operation, and all those people need to get paid. So when an artist pulls out of something like this, many people are affected, so far beyond just the viewing audience, the consumer. So in that way, I hope Billy is on the mend. So then on the other hand, and I don't know if you all know this, but Billy Corgan is also the owner and promoter of the NWA. No, not the guys out of Compton. The NWA, the original NWA, the National Wrestling Alliance. Now, I've made it very clear. I did an episode on wrestling. I have always been and will always be a wrestling aficionado. It's just in my blood. As I say, growing up in Connecticut in the shadow of Titan Tower, I can't help it. I love the art form. So Billy had been a vice president and potential owner of another wrestling company called Impact Wrestling. Impact had been known as TNA. Dirty Minds, that's not what it means. It means total nonstop action. And they became rebranded as Impact Wrestling, which was actually the name of their program. It was TNA Impact. And now they're just Impact Wrestling. Couple of buyouts. So there was a main corporation that owned it called Panda Energy out of Texas, a energy firm, oil, etc. And went through a couple of different iterations and ownership groups. And ultimately, they have been purchased by a company called Anthem Sports out of Canada, who own a number of networks and then ended up buying the Access and the affiliates of Access TV, which was owned by Mark Cuban, who I believe may remain in a minority ownership stake. But nevertheless, Anthem Sports Group, they took over all that programming. That left Billy on the outside in. So before Anthem purchased it, Billy had invested, I want to say anywhere from $1 million to $2 million of his own dollars to help Impact Wrestling, pay their bills, pay their talent, pay their crew, pay all the people that work there. And really, it was his hope, I believe, and he has said as such, so not just I believe, he wanted to purchase the company. He was willing to put up his own capital. The wrestling business is petty. Like, it seems petty, particularly not even just amongst the talent, like ownership groups. It's a very competitive landscape, and it's one of those things that there's plenty to go around, so I don't quite understand the WWE has gone for supremacy. They're the WWE universe. They're on network TV, all that. It's a whole different ballgame. But Billy found himself on the outside looking in. He sued, wanted to get his money back. He's like, I invested. There was no ROI, got nothing back. And he felt kind of screwed out of the whole thing. So that brings us to the National Wrestling Alliance, which had been known as a dead brand. It has this huge lineage and history going back to like 1903 or something, like absurd. And the NWA had actually thrived as a collection of different territories. So, for example, the Pacific Northwest, you had a promoter out there who had his own little territory. So he ran Washington, Oregon, upstate, Northern California, those kind of things. And then you had someone like, the Von Erichs that were down in Texas, or the Funks, or the Guerreros. You had down in Florida, you had Championship Wrestling from Florida. You had your Midwestern territory, So anyway, it was all over the United States where these individual promoters had, their territory. So think of it from a sales perspective. You have someone who, my father-in-law sold medical supplies. So his territory was like at one point, like much of the Midwest. But let's say when he was just starting out, it was like Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas City, Missouri, Kansas and Missouri. Sorry, it's Kansas City is in Missouri and Kansas. But like that was his territory. Same thing with wrestling. With this agreement that the national governing body, the NWA, would have the main champion, right? The champion, the world's heavyweight champion. Guys like Harley Race, Dory and Terry Funk, Dory Jr., Ric Flair, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, so on and so forth. Dusty Rhodes, baby. And they would travel as the champion to these different territories. And that what made it a draw. So you're in the, middle of Peoria, and you're going to your normal, you're the promotion that you go to most frequently. And Harley Race is going to be on top of the card. Usually going to be challenged. So Harley Race normally worked as a heel, a bad guy. Whoever the local babyface was, the good guy. Now Harley's going to win. Everyone kind of knew it, but you made it competitive, and he made the local champion look like $1 million. So anyway, when the WWE expanded, so the WWF, they were going national. The AWA, the American Wrestling Alliance, they were going national. And Georgia Championship Wrestling, which later through different iterations, WCW, were going national. Cable made that possible. Closed circuit TV, pay-per-view, etc. So a company like WWF was buying up all the different territories. And when you have this loose affiliate like the NWA, where they don't actually have, other than Georgia Championship Wrestling and early WCW, they would park themselves, with one overarching promotion as being like their home base. But once WCW became its own entity with its own champions, its own title belts, its own branding, you end up having the AWA, WCW, WWF. The NWA was then kind of left as this drift list form that didn't really have a home base. So I believe they ended up finding like two homes, Championship Wrestling from Hollywood, Championship Wrestling from Florida, and I think loose affiliations maybe with Smoky Mountain Championship Wrestling. And like they got some brief airplay on WWF as like an outside company coming in kind of thing. But really, the brand didn't have much cachet until it had been brought back around 2001 when I mentioned TNA Impact, which Billy would later be a part of, right? Guy by the name of Jeff Jarrett, a third generation promoter, wrestler, etc. He was a champion in every company that he went to, world champion in WCW. He started that company with a partnership with the NWA. So their TNA World Heavyweight Champion was actually the NWA World Heavyweight Champion. Once that relationship, basically what it got to the point was that TNA grew at such a rate that they were able to have their own brand, and they decided to terminate their relationship with the NWA. So this is truly now at this point, they're truly adrift in the wilderness. WWE is the biggest brand in town. WCW is gone. ECW is gone. AWA is gone. The territories are gone. It's like indie promotions, and the NWA just has these couple of places. Like I said, Championship Wrestling from Hollywood and Florida, and a couple of indies, here and there throughout the country. But it's kind of a dark era for the NWA. Well, Billy Corgan reaches out to the board of directors of the NWA, because they still had this kind of governing body feel to them, and says, I'd like to buy the brand. And like, it's a dead brand, Billy. He's like, it's got the history, prestige, hell of a title belt. No, I want to buy it. I want to buy the IP, the intellectual property. So he does. So Billy buys the NWA outright and has determined that it's going to be a promotion in and of itself. However, he knew that was going to take a while. So he aligned himself with a gentleman by the name of Nick Aldis, who had been known as Magnus in TNA, where he got to know him. And gradually taking, talents from other companies, a mixture of veterans, up-and-comers on the indies, etc., and kind of recreating old school, early 80s studio wrestling. So a very niche product produced with a clear homage to that time period. The only difference is modern cameras, HD cameras, and using YouTube as a source to distribute. So this has been going on for about, I want to say 3 years now. Some fantastic stuff that happened within there. But as of late, Billy has been in the news, both mainstream news, laryngitis, etc., all the music magazines, all the music trades, right? But also for the wrestling media and mainstream, because the relationship that he has with Aldis has fractured seemingly. Now, I'm of the opinion this is all what they call a work in the wrestling business. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I don't freaking know. But the guy who just had to cancel shows to laryngitis has been on multiple wrestling podcasts, radio shows, talk shows, etc., getting very animated and adding some bass into that very cherubic Billy Corgan voice, that whiny voice. He's a little mad. So I'm wondering how much of his throat issues that he's having is the fact that he's been doing all this press, yelling and screaming about the situation with Aldis, while also having to go out and perform every night, like 2 or 3 hours. Seems like a bad situation. So now let's circle back to what I started the podcast with, which is I don't freaking know Billy's, political persuasion, anything like that. But people are hyper-focused on who people affiliate with, right? Now, I think it's stupid, and I'll tell you why. A majority of people, regardless of how they categorize themselves, maybe they prefer to have a D next to their name, or an R next to their name, or an L, or a G, or an R, or whatever it is. Most people in the United States are kind of down the middle. They kind of see it all, right? That's my opinion. I think most people are basically centrists. They're basically moderate. Most people. You have a lot of people on extremes everywhere. Everywhere. And of course, not to get too granular in the United States, political system, we have 2 parties. And in other countries, they have 3, 4, 5 different parties. And to some extent, I think that keeps people honest. That's just me. It doesn't have specific agendas that really own everything, right? But anyway, Billy is the promoter. They had a pay-per-view on Saturday night, and Billy Corgan, so as the promoter, he puts the title on whoever he wants to. And he has what's called a 3-way match with a gentleman by the name of Matt Cardona, who used to be in WWE as Zack Ryder. This guy is like 6'1", 6'2", jacked to the gills, fantastic shape, just all muscle. Great shape. Tons of charisma, tons of personality. You have the champion, Trevor Murdoch, who is 6'3", about 300 and change, somewhere around there. Big dude, big old Southern style wrestler, like the Stan Hansens, the Harley races. Like, he's just got that whole vibe going on. Like, you're straight out of late 70s, early 80s, kind of NWA style, Very reminiscent of that. The guy has the look. And the other challenger is a gentleman by the name of Tyrus, who had been in WWE as Brodus Clay. He was also known as the, was it Funkasaurus? Nevertheless, he also happens to be a talking head and commentator on Fox News, where he has very clearly stated where his proclivities are, but he's on one of the highest rated shows on that network. A lot of eyes on that product. So he has won and become the NWA World's Heavyweight Champion. And people have lost their minds. Now, part of it is because he's clearly out of shape and he's never been a body guy. He's like 6'8" or something and just massive ton of humanity, right? He's been a bodyguard for like major stars. But he doesn't move around particularly well, you know what I mean? And he's getting older, plus he's carrying a lot of this mass, you know? So he can't wrestle, and he's a Fox guy and all this, and people are mad. So of course, who is going to bear the brunt of this? The promoter, Billy Corgan. Now, Billy does not give a fluffernutter. Doesn't. He's like, I like big dudes, old school wrestling, big guys, big masses of humanity, beating the hell out of each other. And anything else, I don't care. Plus, this guy is on a major cable platform, the #1 cable news programming. So you got all this exposure. So between the Aldis thing that he's in this pissing match with, you have this whole controversy, if you will, about putting the title on Tyrus. And you got the laryngitis. And just like, good grief, Billy. This is how you're in the news. So they say there's no such thing as bad publicity. So clearly, William Patrick Corgan has taken this ball, ran with it, and he is all about controversy. Because, as another promoter once said, a guy by the name of Eric Bischoff, controversy creates cash. So, that is what kicked off in my head this evening. So then I started thinking about, I'm going to do the episode on the Smashing Pumpkins. You know what I mean? And then my brain started going in all different directions. So there's a little background of Billy being in the news. So now this is going to be kind of a just spitballing at this point about a bunch of stuff that pops into my head when I think of Billy Corgan. So one, I think about when I first heard them. So my wife is a fan of the Pumpkins going back to Gish, which was, their first release on Caroline Records. Let's see, the band was formed in like 88, so this probably came out 90, 91, something like that. The original band, so like I said, James and Jimmy, Billy and Darcy. And minor hit, US tour kind of thing, touring with a bunch of different bands. And then Billy had the writer's block. And now that they've achieved a certain level, they ended up getting signed by Virgin Records. I think it was Virgin. And he's got this writer's block. He doesn't know where to go. And he sits down, and there's a song, which is not the first song I heard for them, by the way, but a song called Today, which you might know the opening strains. Dun, 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 dun. That was the first thing he had written after his writer's block, which is why the opening line is "Today's the greatest day I've ever known," because he'd broken through. But the first time I'd heard them was on the single soundtrack in a song called Drown. And I was like, what is this? Because they got lumped in with the whole grunge thing. But yeah, they had some, I guess, sonic similarities to the, loud, quiet, loud dynamic that I talked about with Cobain. So I definitely think in that regard, they were they were similar, right? Really aggressive drumming, Dave Grohl, Jimmy Chamberlain, except with the Pumpkins, it's a two guitar attack plus bass. And I think similarly to Kurt, both Kurt and Billy have atypical singing voices. So not really conventional. And Drown was a great track, but still unique enough from the other things that were on the record that were considered truly grunge, And when that Siamese Dream record came out, I remember going to the store and getting it. Strawberries Records, Town Line, Meriden Wallingford, and popping that sucker in. And to this day, there's really nothing like it. There's really nothing like that album. So if you haven't heard it, and I don't know how you haven't, but maybe you only heard the singles or whatever, go get it. Now, what blows my mind is that album was 4 times platinum. Their follow-up record was a double record. Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness. I had no idea that did 10 million units. That sold more than Siamese Dream, a double record. Blows my mind. Some great stuff on there. But I couldn't tell you that I listened to that in its entirety because, I went back and, listened to Gish. So between Gish and Siamese Dream, I just think you have Perfection. And then they had the EP of covers, Pisces Iscariot. Like that whole little early 90s phase of Smashing Pumpkins, I think is amongst the best rock and roll has to offer ever, regardless of genre. Just really hitting on all cylinders and just some really great stuff. So the similarities with, Nirvana, which, Billy had always been really acutely aware of. And that probably extended, and I mentioned it on The Women of Rock, his relationship with Courtney Love, after Kurt had died and working on, her album and stuff. But you had a couple of producers that had some overlap. And I admit, I get them conflated sometimes. So the guy who really got the foot in the door as far as I think the sound quality of the Smashing Pumpkins, like capturing their sound, which sometimes is just as much about the producer being able to capture it, like really get down what they're doing on tape. And that was Butch Vig. So Butch Vig, who might be, best known from some people for being in the band Garbage, but Butch Vig did, he did Nevermind by Nirvana, as well as, where is it here? Production. I mean, a ton of stuff. I started thinking about him. So Billy Corgan got me going down this road. So bands like Killdozer, Smashing Pumpkins, did Gish in 91, Nevermind also in 91. So think about that. Gish is coming out of, Chicago, and Nevermind's coming out of Seattle. Tad, do you remember Tad out of Seattle? Did House of Pain, Shamrocks and Shenanigans, Sonic Youth, Dirty. I mean, Helmet, Betty, what a good record that is. So Jimmy Eat World, Chase the Light. That was Butch Vig. So I kind of get him mixed up with Steve Albini. So Steve Albini was another guy who was in that time period who recorded Nirvana in Utero. But right around that same time, just slightly preceding that, he did one of my all-time favorite records, which I kind of call this the hindsight 2020. I didn't hear it when it first came out. It was a couple years later, and a friend of mine turned me on to a band called Jawbreaker. And Jawbreaker has an album called 24-Hour Revenge Therapy, which is without a doubt one of my all-time favorite recordings, period. So Steve Albini did that, and there have some who have said, whoever they are, that he kind of perfected some sound techniques on 24-hour revenge therapy and then applied that to In Utero, which is really interesting. It's like really interesting because they couldn't be more dissimilar records because the bands are so different. But, Jawbreaker, like every album for the most part is just fantastic. And if you haven't heard them, I really beseech you to go and seek them out because they kind of came out of that Berkeley Street scene and still managed to be really unique. Blake Schwarzenbach is definitely a singer-songwriter, but within kind of a, they joke about the, what's punk, right? What's punk? What's the score? Like, pop punk, whatever. It's just, it's not definable, but Jawbreaker, check him out. So then it got me thinking more and more about kind of the not really necessarily unsung bands, because the people who love them, really love them, will tell you, gosh, I've been listening to them for years. It's kind of that whole hipster mentality, I guess, of, oh yeah, I listened to them before they were cool. But there are so many bands that either A, I had stumbled upon early and then they blew up. Blind Melon. I stumbled upon them and turns out they were fantastic, truly. A band like Black Train Jack, which although they didn't like break out and transcend into the top of the charts, nevertheless, that was a discovery that changed my mind about things. A record like Angel Dust by Faith No More, completely undigestible for others, amazing for someone like me. But there are bands that I just didn't get, or it took me a while to get. So I started thinking about some of these bands that I mentioned, your Nirvanas, and even early Smashing Pumpkins, and that Sub Pop records. I started thinking about, Sub Pop and how many bands kind of came through that record label, So there was the, what is that? Something just happened. I was looking this up and it went crazy on me. So Sub Pop did they had the Sub Pop 100 and the Sub Pop 200, for example, which were compilations of a whole bunch of bands. So this one came out in 86. Wow, back to 1986. So like 86, I'm like listening to Poison, right? But you have Steve Albini, Scratch Acid, Vipers, Sonic Youth, Naked Ray Gun, U-Men, Skinny Puppy, Steve Fisk, Lupe Diaz, Savage Republic, and Shonen Knife. I did not realize that Shonen Knife had been around for that long. Japanese pop punk, man, it's good stuff. Influenced by 60s girl groups, pop bands, and the Beach Boys, as well as early punk rock bands like the Ramones. So then fast forward 2 years, the Sub Pop 200. Listen to this. Tad, who I mentioned earlier, The Fluid, Nirvana, Stephen J. Bernstein, Mudhoney, The Walkabouts, Terry Lee Hale, Soundgarden, Green River, which would become, kind of a couple of bands out of that. Fastbacks, Blood Circus, Girl Trouble, Screaming Trees. Oh, Screaming Trees. Oh, man. Mark Lanigan, man. Such an amazing singer and songwriter. I think most people know the hit, I Nearly Lost You, which is a really great song. But, I'm going to forget other songs now. And I listened to a bunch of Mark stuff just a few months ago, and I'm not going to be able to remember a single song title. So then you have The Grunge Years, which is another compilation album by Sub Pop. Nirvana, L7, Tad, Beat Happening, Mark Lanigan, Screaming Trees, Fluid, Babes in Toyland, Mudhoney Again, The Walkabouts, Love Battery, Dickless, and then the first appearance on the Sub Pop comp, a little band called the Afghan Whigs. Now, I know that I've mentioned them before, but they're just called, a rock band. They came up through grunge via Cincinnati, Ohio. And I don't really know what you call them, honestly. But what's really interesting, because I don't think of them as being a mainstream act per se, but they released their major label debut and fourth album, Gentlemen, in 1993. Pitchfork described them as one of the few alt bands to flourish on a major label in the 1990s. I guess I have to consider, what does that mean exactly about flourishing and on a major record label? Because I kind of look at it from the perspective that record labels are they have expectations if they're going to invest in you, right? So an album like Gentlemen, great album, by the way, that didn't make any charts here in the States. Not a single one. But gosh, some of these songs, if you've never heard it, listen to My Curse. Listen to My Curse. It's written by Dooley, and he does a version where he sings it. But it's Marcy May. And oh gosh, I'm going to forget the name of her band now. Scrawl. It is so moving, so powerful. Just a really, really good song. And I've always likened that The Gentleman was the cousin to Only by Anthrax. But I didn't know about this band. So I moved to Boston 95, something like that. And ended up having a group of friends up there, and a buddy of mine turned me on to the Whigs. And in particular, this time, Black Love had come out. So that came out in 1996. And that was released both through Elektra Records and Sub Pop. So it must have been kind of a distribution deal. And this is just tremendous. And it actually made it to number 79 on the Billboard 200. And then, of course, 1965, which had a couple of minor radio hits and had been in a couple of movie soundtracks. And that did not do as well as Black Love. This came in at number 176 with arguably more radio-friendly content on there. So the Afghan Whigs are such a unique thing in the fact that they come out of, grunge and Sub Pop, yet incorporated as they were going along more and more elements of R&B, but just a typical approach to R&B, but still very rooted in that style. So when I think about the Afghan Whigs and kind of how I kind of came upon them a little bit later, there are other bands that I just completely missed on and still don't have enough of an understanding of their discography. But I will tell you that a band like Shudder to Think, how were Shudder to Think not a bigger band than they were? They were a kind of 120 minutes act, but also heavy. You know what I mean? And I think those bands that, I don't know, it's I guess heavy without the aggression and like the machismo. I think those bands sometimes get lost, right? So here's such a great. So this is from the Wikipedia page, right? Shudder to Think. Formed in 1986, they released 3 albums on the Washington, D.C. based label, Discord Records. You might have heard of it. and 2 on Epic Records. Their early work was largely influenced by post-hardcore, although they gradually drew upon a wide range of stylistic influences, including pop music and glam metal. I mean, I think that is absolutely a apropos description. But if you haven't heard it, their first record on Epic, the Pony Express record, start there. Just start there, and I guess work your way backwards at that point, and then go forwards. You have to listen to it for yourself. But I will say this, along the lines of completely obscure. So Nathan Larson of Shudder to Think, he is married to oh gosh, Nina. I feel like I've done this on the podcast before. So if I've repeated myself, so sorry. Nina Pearson. Nevertheless, he put out this record that I just still want people to find. So even if I had said this before, I don't even care. You got to find this album called Mind Science of the Mind. I wish people could have heard that record, because to me, it is a pop record. And I think it could be played on radio. Hook heavy stuff. And it's kind of like it just exists in the same alternate universe where the Evil Twins are, because you can't find it anywhere, and it's not on any of the streaming platforms, which is such a bummer. So I know Nathan Larson is not hearing this, but dude, get Mind Science of the Mind up on Spotify or Apple Music, please. I know they don't pay well, but at least the music's out there. Because if they have Crispin Glover on there, oh my gosh, they could have Mind Science of the Mind. So I mentioned just, in these few minutes, Discord Records, run by Ian MacKay. And you have Sub Pop. You have Fat Records, Fat Mike. You have Roadrunner out of New York. Earlier for metal, you had Megaforce Records, John Zazula, and all those early metal bands, thrash metal bands in particular. Tang, like Tang Records. So when I think about Tang, first one that comes to mind is the Lemonheads. But let's see. Artists. So here's the Lemonheads. I'll try to go through the ones that I think people will know. Or at least I know, because they started in Boston and moved to California. But we have Bullet LaVolta, DYS, the Dickies, Dropkick Murphys, the Exploited, the Foreskins, Gangrene, Jerry's Kids, the Lemonheads, Mighty Mighty Boss Tones, Mission of Burma, Moving Targets, Poison Idea, the Ruts, Sam Black Church. Wow, that takes me back. I'll come back to them in just a minute. Slapshot, Spore, SSD, Stiff Little Fingers. Oh my gosh, the Swirlies. But Sam Black Church. It was named after the West Virginia community of Sam Black Church, but origin, Boston, Mass. So I saw them for free at some random show on the Boston Common. But was it the Common or out just aside the Esplanade? Yeah, so I think it had to have been the Public Garden down there. So they were actually in the I don't know, kind of like a gazebo that's on there. They were playing there. Oh, you know what it was? It was the Hemp Fest. So they had Hemp Fest every year, which was like the opportunity for all the potheads to go down there. But also you had a lot of bands that were playing. But they played a frenetic blend of hardcore, metal, and thrash, and shared the bill with acts as diverse as Bad Brains, Clutch, Motorhead, Cro-Mags, Nothing Face, Stuck Mojo, and Helmet. Batang Records had a bunch of really great acts. And for some reason, I feel like there is a band on here. There's a glaring omission. So let me see something here. Because maybe I'm not quite remembering this properly. Discography. Okay. So my bad. I forgot about Lookout Records. So I was thinking that Green Day was on Tang for a minute, but instead they were on Lookout Records, which is best known, obviously, for, I say obviously, Operation Ivy and Green Day. So Operation Ivy ended up splitting off when they broke up, and, Lint, aka Tim Armstrong, went on to form Rancid. But they had Alkaline Trio, Antichrist, Avail, Born Against, let's see, the Crumbs, the Donnas, let's see, Fuel, Green Day, the Groovy Ghoulies, the High Fives, let's see, Mary Timony. Mary Timony, by the way, played on Mind Science of the Mind. Is that on here? Yep, there it is. It does exist. Mind Science of the Mind, Epic Records, 1996. Mary Timony. Neurosis, Operation Ivy, Pansy Division. Let's see. The Queers, Rancid, Sam I Am, Screeching Weasel. Squirt Gun, Ted Leo and the Pharmacists. Okay, Ted Leo and the Pharmacists. I think this is probably going to be the last thing I cover on this, because I will tell you there is a glaring omission on the Ted Leo and the Pharmacist page as far as past members, because I mentioned the dude who kind of turned me on to some of the bands that I just mentioned, Jawbreaker, Afghan Whigs, etc. Guy by the name of Drew O'Doherty. So Drew was childhood friends with my roommate at the time, and we just became fast friends. And my roommate at the time was actually dating like an ex-girlfriend of mine. So we all just knew each other, right? So it was just, we all knew each other. So Drew turned me on to all these bands, but they were, when I first met them, they were in a band called Sidereal out of Boston. And, this was their teen band, now going into their 20s. And they have a couple of fantastic songs. You can't find the pressing anymore. I'm not sure how many copies they did of their CD. And, once they broke up, they kind of all went their different ways. Some of the guys decided they were going to go and finish their degrees. And, Drew decided that he was just going to keep, playing music. Played with a band called the Ivory Coast for a while. And he got the offer to join Ted Leo and the Pharmacists. So he says his most famous or infamous moment, if you will, is that they were playing the Conan O'Brien show. And on the very opening note of the song that they were performing, which I forget what it is at this moment, he broke a string. He broke a string and immediately had to go, okay, I now need to play this song without the string that I need. So like transposing it in his head and like, okay, now this is how I can still play it properly, or as close to properly as possible. So that was his first TV exposure on frickin' Conan O'Brien. and he busts a string immediately. It is what it is, but Ted Leo and the Pharmacists, I ended up seeing them at this little club. I don't think it still exists in Wallingford, no, Hamden, Connecticut. Hamden, Connecticut, the Lodge or something like that. And found out he was playing. But Drew was opening up for him, right? So it was cool because Drew's gone on to do his own solo work. And in fact, you can find it on Bandcamp. You can find it on Apple Music, most platforms. So just type in Drew or Doherty. He has an album called Starts. It's excellent. And there's a couple of sidereal songs that he does on there completely reworked. But yeah, they did this bill at this little tiny club, and they had some great banter where they just talked about the relationship the two of them had, and the Japanese tour and all those kind of things. And we had a couple of nice moments with me as well, and interacting with them on the stage, because as he alluded to, I was there really early on in his musical career, and some of the early shows that they did when he was just getting started out as a musician. So that was me meandering. Whatever Wednesday. So we started with Billy Corgan, a little bit of wrestling, a little bit of drama, a little bit of politics, right into independent record labels, little punk rock bands, little unknown gems, little nuggets here and there, and a little bit of a stroll down memory lane. I'm thinking I might just do an episode on my favorites from these indie record labels, because there's some great stuff that didn't necessarily make it past, a certain level. You know what I mean? Like the stuff that was so good, but never saw a chart, There's another record label, Something AD, which you had bands like Dead Kid Dance and what's it called? Red House Painters and stuff like that. So what are your favorites from the indie record labels? Like some of the stuff that I mentioned, do you listen to them? Are you interested in them? Do you enjoy just kind of a whatever Wednesday, and just whatever pops into my head, we just go down that road? Because once in a while, I think it's just fun to kind of unpack whatever it is that I'm thinking about and see where it goes. But I'd love to have your feedback. Tell me if you enjoyed the show. So how can you do that? You can reach me on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at StuckPodX. You can go over to the Facebook page, Stuck in the Middle, a Gen X podcast. You can email me at stuckinthemiddlepod@yahoo.com. Please leave comments, 5-star reviews, likes, and most importantly, please subscribe. Subscribe today, whether it is the audio podcast or here on YouTube. Please subscribe. So, until next time. Later, slackers.